On the last Sunday of November, I issued you a challenge in worship. The challenge was to sit down and read the Gospel of Mark in one sitting. I've heard some responses from that challenge, not from all of you, but some of you. Maybe you can see the importance of that challenge now. For you see, the first 7 Sundays of this year, we have 5 of them with the gospel lessons from the Gospel of Mark, all from the first chapter. We're moving through this gospel at a snail's pace, and if you have seen the entire gospel and read the entire gospel, these little snippets begin to make sense to you. Today we take up where we left last Sunday, and this is first appearance of Jesus in public ministry as recorded by Mark. Mark, the first chapter, verse 21. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed. And they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. I want to share a list with you this morning, a list of names, some of whom you may know, many you probably do not know. Cortland Creech, Dorothy Carmichael, Clark Thompson, Lucille Edwards, Claude Schatz, Howard Cox, and David Graybeal. The first Sunday of this year, I quoted from the hymn, "O God, Our Help in Ages Past," and Cortland Creech was my 5th grade Sunday school teacher here. She had us memorize that hymn, stand in pairs, and sing it to the class, 4 verses. Probably not the best singing in the world, but that hymn has stuck with me for over 50 years, and I remember Mrs. Creech as a caring teacher. As the political debates and the campaign season really starts up, I will always remember my 6th grade teacher at Ardmore Elementary School, Dorothy Carmichael. She helped us understand our government and the political system with the election cycle of John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. After John Kennedy was elected, we went to Dorothy's house to watch the inauguration on her color TV in 1961. Clark Thompson came to home church in 1960, and I was totally amazed how he could teach anything and everything and make it so interesting. And whenever I write an article for the newsletter or write a sermon, I remember my high school English teacher, Lucille Edwards, who used to say, "Write rapidly and revise, revise, revise." And whenever I hear a new idea, I'm challenged to think outside of the box. I remember Claude Schatz from Guilford College, the director of off-campus studies. Claude was well beyond retirement age when I got to Guilford College, but he was one of the best thinkers and was always searching for new ideas. I cannot read a passage from the Old Testament without remembering Howard Cox, my Old Testament professor at Moravian Seminary. Howard brought the Old Testament to life, and he gave it new meaning for me and a connection that I will never forget. And any time in the church when we have difficulty discussing hard issues, I remember my professor, David Graybill at Drew University, who taught me that we can discuss anything in the church and that there's nothing that we should not be able to discuss in the church. And more importantly, we can disagree and we cannot be of the same mind, but we can be in community. These are my teachers who I value, treasure, and remember. And that's a rather amazing thing that after all these years, they still exert an influence on my life. They probably were poorly paid, and you've never heard of many of them, yet consider their power and influence. These teachers changed my life, and I will never forget them. You could come up with a list of teachers that were influential in your life. Think about your children and how many times they came home from school and said, Mrs. Brown said today that. And it may have been something you had said to your children many times before, but it's as if they had heard it for the first time. Teachers change lives. They create, through teaching, new worlds. Most of us are deeply indebted to teachers throughout our lives. So today we have our gospel lesson with Jesus entering the synagogue and teaching. Take note, Jesus was a teacher. He was not called reverend or father. He was called rabbi, which means teacher. Mark refers to Jesus as a teacher more frequently than the other gospel writers. Jesus begins his ministry in a sacred place at a sacred time with 4 disciples. Remember last week, we heard Jesus calling 4 disciples, Simon and Andrew, James and John. Now they go to Capernaum. Capernaum was out in Galilee. In other words, it was out in nowhere. I guess you could say that Jesus was in Tobaccoville. No offense to Tobaccoville. He did not start his ministry in Jerusalem among the learned and powerful with sophisticated urbanites. No, out in Galilee. He started his ministry in the synagogue on the Sabbath. The synagogue was the unique invention of Israel during the exile period. It was a place of teaching, a place where the tradition is passed on and clarified for the faithful. Into this place of reading, listening, teaching, and reflection, Jesus began his ministry, and he teaches. Mark gives us no detail at all for the content of the teaching on that occasion. He only gives us the reaction of the people. Mark simply states, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. And then he tells us the reaction. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Then someone breaks out in the scene in the synagogue on the Sabbath, screaming at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus impresses the crowd and attracts the attention of demons. Martin Luther said, where the gospel is preached, devils are set loose to start to roam among us. The same can be said of teaching. The man possessed by the demon challenges Jesus' authority. Jesus came to teach and he's interrupted. He rebukes the man and the demon came out of him. And the people were amazed and said, "What is this? A new teaching with authority?" The man possessed by the demon is the first person to identify Jesus. First, he called him by his common name, Jesus of Nazareth. Then he goes on to identify him as the Holy One of God. That man knew more about Jesus that day in the synagogue than anyone else. Jesus' identity was announced at his baptism by a voice from heaven, and now it's shouted out by a man possessed by a demon. The demon recognized Jesus for who he was. The gospel writer Mark underscores the authority of Jesus as a teacher. Last week, Mark told us that Jesus' word is so powerful that people abandon their occupations and follow him. The people sitting in the synagogue proclaimed that Jesus is more powerful than the scribes, and now Mark stresses that Jesus is stronger than demonic powers. One purpose of Mark's gospel is to allow us to participate with Jesus and with those first disciples in the gradual and growing recognition of who he is until we reach the conclusion to which the demonic man already points. The power of the gospel is the way it constantly confronts us with the basic questions and opens the door to fresh perceptions. Are we prepared to recognize with the original observers and Mark that Jesus of Nazareth is exactly who the troubled man said he was, the Holy One of God? And please notice that there in the synagogue, the people were astounded at the teaching of Jesus, and they were amazed at the exorcism, to the point of asking, is this a new teaching with authority? Amazement is not faith. Astonishment and wonder do not create a sturdy basis for faith. They can only open our eyes to the possibilities of faith. We have to go beyond amazement and wonder to claim who Jesus is for us. Jesus taught with power and authority, and it is much more than imparting interesting information. When Jesus taught, there was a cosmic confrontation, and that Sabbath day in the synagogue, Jesus confronted evil. Jesus' teaching has the power to liberate, to conquer, and to heal. Now, if we view Jesus as our master teacher, we have to put ourselves in places where we can learn about him and learn from him. We have to constantly strive for new knowledge and more faith. We have to claim our need for education and learning. The last 3 weeks have been wonderful study opportunities for us in the chapel. We have one more today, and the response has been great. The challenge before us now is to keep up the good work, for you to put yourself in places where you can grow and learn. Education and formation are constant needs for all of us for all the days of our lives. Amen.